What's your childhood mystery that you finally solved years later? Story 1. I remember being about 8 and in the car with my dad. I was in the front seat and we were driving somewhere, and this song came on the radio. He cranked it up and said something about it being the best guitar playing ever. He really jammed out, which was really uncharacteristic because he was usually so stoic. It was the only time I ever heard the song, and he passed away before I could ask him what it was. When I asked around, no one knew what I was talking about or could recognize the song I was thinking of. So I had this melody in my head for years. But how do you look up a song that has no lyrics? For years and years, this song stayed on the back burner in my brain. I was afraid to forget it. Somehow, this story came up when I was around 26, chatting with my husband, and we searched YouTube for best guitar songs. After about 15 minutes, we found it. Cliffs of Dover was the song that had been burned into my brain for 16 years. Now I jam out to it with my kids. Story 2. I solved a family mystery for my mom. I wasn't allowed to play console video games during the week all the way until I was 18, but some nights I'd really be craving it, so I would noiselessly creep through my house into the basement, where I could play video games in peace. But once every 30 times or so, one of my parents would need something from the basement, and I'd quickly turn off the TV monitor, hide in the guest room, and pray they didn't turn on a light or notice the console was on. One night I ducked into the guest room and hid behind the bed. To my horror, my mom followed me into the room and turned on the lights. I was panicking, so when she started digging through the closet with her back to me, I made a run for it. I nearly brushed her shirt, and if she'd seen me, I probably would have scared her badly. But I made it and ran all the way to bed. About 5 years went by, and my mom said something like, "You're such a quiet walker." And I told her it was because of my basement trips, thinking I had nothing to lose. My mom's face went kind of solemn, and when I explained, she said, "So there really was someone down there." She explained that she remembered that exact night and the feeling that there was a presence in the room. Over the next couple of days, she'd stare into space and just say, "I can't believe you were really there." She seemed to get over it, but she probably checks empty rooms a little more carefully now. Story 3. We grew up with very little money, and at the age of 10, my friends were all having these extravagant birthday parties with petting zoos, bounce houses, clowns, and so on. So my mother, who is very resourceful, decided I would have a sleepover for my 11th birthday. It was great, and we were going to make ice cream cones. So we got all the stuff out with my mom, and she opened up the box of cones, and they were all smashed. She told us that we weren't having regular ice cream. We were having Magic Castle sundaes because the broken cones resembled castle towers. We all thought this was awesome and enjoyed them. When my friends went home, they asked their parents to make Magic Castle sundaes. 2 days ago, I found out that my mother was getting food that was past the sell-by date from behind the grocery store. They weren't expired, just past the sell-by. She had no idea that the cones were broken until she opened the box with us. She quickly came up with the Magic Castle idea on the spot, and we all loved it. Just goes to show how easily kids can be delighted with a little creativity. Story 4. As a kid, I played Medal of Honor, Allied Assault with my brother. We got to the 5th level, which took place in a rainy French city similar to the one in Saving Private Ryan. However, we always got stuck on the first objective, which was to locate the bazooka team. There were no clues as to where this team was in the massive rubble-filled city with poor visibility. To make things worse, hidden enemy snipers would constantly fire at you, making the search even harder. My brother and I scoured every nook and cranny, but we never found the team. If they were trying to stay hidden, they were doing an excellent job. In the months that followed, we reinstalled and replayed the game several times, but we always got stuck on that level. Fast forward several years, and I got the digital version of Allied Assault for nostalgia's sake. I dreaded playing the 5th level again, but to my surprise, I easily cleared the first objective by stumbling across the corpses of the bazooka team in one of the buildings. Turns out the CD we originally played on was bugged. The bodies never rendered in the game. All we had done was waste countless hours looking for a group that never actually appeared. Giddy at the prospect of finally completing the game, I happily continued the level, only to quit again after repeatedly getting sniped by those hidden snipers. Story 5. My father used to take us camping, hiking, and on bike rides. He taught us about safety in the woods and on the water, and how to navigate using maps. So it wasn't all that strange when he said one day, I was maybe 10, we were doing a game where we'd be blindfolded and taken on a drive. The object of the game was to call out what direction we were turning by feel, and then ultimately, after driving about 30 minutes, give a guess roughly where we were and which direction home was in. He was impressed by how well we did, and we took off the blindfolds and went for a hike. I never thought much about it. Years later, I realized why we played the game. My dad worked in criminal psychology, especially with cases involving offenders. He was preparing us for potential danger, essentially kidnap-proofing us, but in a lighthearted way so there was no fear or trauma. Story 6. When I was 4, I vividly remember getting into my mom's car and her telling me that our cat had died. She said she had rushed him to the vet and that he was shedding fur. Something was seriously wrong. Despite her best efforts, he didn't make it. I never knew why he died or why it happened so suddenly, but I accepted it. Fast forward about 15 years, I was home from college for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, I was out driving to the store with my dad and uncle. They started talking about the cat my parents had gotten one Christmas. Yes, the same one. My dad said, "Yeah, that thing was too aggressive, so I took it to a farm and gave it away." Normally, when a pet passes away, parents will soften the truth and say it went to a farm to ease the child's burden. Not my parents. They gave me the harsh version of the story, even though it wasn't actually true. Story 7. My uncle, single, no kids, lived a few houses away from my grandparents, so my siblings and I would go between the houses and always loved my uncle's place. He had a huge tropical fish tank and let us play video games. He was the most fun uncle, always taking us to the movies, amusement parks, fishing, golfing, and keeping us laughing the whole time. But over time, he became less comfortable with us popping over, and we eventually resorted to sneaking into his house. We didn't get far before he got upset. From that point on, we only saw him at our grandparents' house. We used to joke with him about having a girlfriend over. Fast forward 17 years, he had a massive heart attack. While he was in the hospital, his sisters went into his house to look for paperwork and get things ready for his return. That's when they found rooms full of empty bottles of cheap vodka. My uncle had been struggling with severe alcoholism for years, and none of us knew. Suddenly, so many little things made sense. He passed away shortly afterward due to organ failure caused by alcoholism. He wasn't even 60. Story 8. I had meningitis when I was 2 years old, and my baby brother had it too, but he didn't survive. I had the viral form, and he had the bacterial form. I grew up thinking I got it first and always felt like I had given it to him and was somehow responsible for his death. I know that sounds irrational, but you can't help what you think, especially when you're a child. It wasn't until I was an adult that I found out he actually had it before I did. I don't know why no one told me that before. Maybe they didn't realize I had carried that guilt with me, since I never talked about it. No one had ever mentioned that he passed before I got sick. Or maybe it happened while I was in the hospital. That part still isn't clear to me. I was hospitalized for about 3 weeks, so it could have been before or during my stay. Story 9. I wasn't a kid anymore. But some years ago, when my mom was terminally ill, my family started receiving food-based gifts from friends. Prepped dinners, baked snacks, restaurant gift cards, the usual gestures of support people offer during hard times. I remembered my dad once asking me if I had tried the pastries we got from some family friends. We'll call them the Nelsons. I told him they were a little dry, but really tasty, and he chuckled. That moment stuck with me because his question and reaction seemed oddly specific. A couple of years later, while driving and spacing out, I remembered his strange reaction and the fact that the Nelsons had mentioned growing marijuana at home. Around the same time, they had also suggested easing mom's pain with it. It hit me then. I had eaten cookies with marijuana in them. I had no clue at the time. I feel so silly for not realizing it sooner. And honestly, I don't remember anything that happened after eating them. Story 10. When we were kids, we used to ride our bikes up the road to this horse ranch that sat on a hill. So many memories up there. Off in the distance was a huge hill that eventually got bought and turned into a winery. This hill was completely covered in trees, except for the bare area that faced us. One autumn afternoon, my best buddy and I spotted something very furry walking on 2 feet from one tree to another. The hill was likely hundreds of yards away from us, but whatever we saw was clearly much bigger than we were. Since the sun was setting, the whole thing really scared us. We screamed and tore down the road on our dirt bikes, terrified of whatever that thing was. Years later, I found out that what we had seen was most likely a bear walking upright, but for nearly a decade, my buddy and I were convinced we had seen Bigfoot. Story 11. For over 20 years, I had a very distinct memory of watching a movie with my dad around the holidays in our living room. It was a black and white film, but I remembered only one specific scene. I was probably about 6 or 7 when I saw it with him. It stuck with me for the longest time. I would think about it periodically for years because I remembered it being so cool, and I just wanted to know what movie it was so I could watch it again as an adult. Then one day, I can't even recall where, I saw someone online describing a movie and mentioning the name. It sounded really similar to what I remembered. I looked it up on YouTube, and it turns out the movie was Babes in Toyland / March of the Wooden Soldiers. The scene I had remembered so vividly was when all of the soldiers march out of the toy shop. Figuring this out was genuinely one of the most satisfying feelings I've ever had. Story 12. I was brought up in Ireland, and unusually for the area, my parents never drank. Every Christmas, our family friends would forget this and gift them bottles of alcohol. Naturally, my parents either stored the bottles of whiskey, vodka, etc. in the storeroom or re-gifted them. One year when I was 8 years old, they received a really fancy bottle of 40-year-old Scottish whiskey. It looked so cool that they placed it proudly on the mantelpiece. As I grew taller and more mischievous, by the time I was 16, my parents decided to go out of town for the weekend. My 18-year-old brother came up with the idea that we should pull an Ocean's 11 on that bottle, take it to a huge party with lots of people and music. I told him we'd surely get caught because that bottle was like the centerpiece of the living room. But my brother, who's so cunning you could put a tail on him and call him a fox, had a plan. We drink the fancy whiskey, bring the bottle back, and refill it with cold Irish black tea. We did exactly that and had an amazing time. When Mom and Dad got back, they didn't notice a thing. Time passed, days into months, seasons came and went, and both of us were in college. We came home one Christmas and immediately noticed that the bottle was gone. We panicked, thinking, she's going to figure it out and we're done for. But nothing was said, and the holiday passed peacefully. A few more years went by. When I was around 24, I was working at a hospital and would often have lunch with the janitors and handymen. After about 3 months, one older Irish gentleman I had gotten to know said, "Older man, young man, do you like whiskey?" Me, "Of course I do." Older man, "Well, let me tell you a story. Years ago, your father asked me to paint the outside of your house. When he tried to pay me, I refused and jokingly asked if I could take that 50-year-old bottle of fine Scottish whiskey instead. Your dad thought it was a great deal, and I went home happy. My wife made me a steak, poured me a big glass of whiskey, and I sat on the porch. But when I took a sip, I nearly had a heart attack. It was cold tea. In that moment, I felt like I was in the final scene of The Usual Suspects. I was speechless. I offered to repay him, but he just laughed and said, "I was young once too." Now I'm 45 years old and my parents still have no idea that we stole the whiskey, replaced it with tea, and that a hard-working man drank it thinking it was a reward. Story 13. I had nightmares for years. Literally every dream I had involved my older sister being a robot trying to harm me. She would appear as a tank, transformer-like machines, metallic spiders, all of them with her face and dangerous weapons. Every metallic robot imaginable somehow had my sister's face on it. I had these dreams throughout all of elementary school. It wasn't until I brought it up at age 17 that we finally solved the mystery. I was born extremely premature, 4 months early. I had a lot of medical complications, stayed in the NICU for 5 months, had multiple surgeries, and was fed through a tube. My mom was heartbroken that I couldn't meet my sister, and she couldn't meet me. She was 4 at the time. So she placed a picture of my sister's face above my incubator so I could see her. It was a sweet idea, but it had an unexpected effect. My brain associated my sister's face with all the surgical tools and scary hospital machines I was surrounded by. It took us years to realize that my nightmares were my brain, combining the two things I was most exposed to as an infant: my sister's photo and terrifying medical equipment. Story 14. When I was a child, I believed in Santa Claus. As I got older, especially through elementary school, I started becoming more skeptical. But one thing kept me believing longer than most kids. How did every single adult have the same story? Every grown-up could name the reindeer, explain where Santa lived, how he delivered gifts, what he wore, how the toys were made, and what happened if you were naughty. How could it all be a lie if every adult knew the exact same details? I figured it must be some global secret society or government-level cover-up to keep the story going. I wondered for years how such an elaborate conspiracy could exist. I finally cracked one Christmas when I asked Santa for coal and instead got charcoal. Suspiciously, it looked just like the kind my parents kept in the garage. I questioned them about it, and they finally confessed. They told me that everything I thought I knew about Santa came from stories, songs, movies, and television. There was no conspiracy, just generations of adults who had listened to too many winter playlists at the mall. Story 15. When I was in elementary school, we were learning about different cultures and the folklore associated with them. I have a decent amount of Irish in my heritage, so naturally I perked up when we started learning about Ireland, more specifically, leprechauns. Our teacher told us a tale about how leprechauns love flower petals, and that if they were ever caught, they'd give you a gift in exchange for their freedom. So naturally, I started hatching a plan. When I got home, I told my mom all about what I had learned and how I was going to catch a leprechaun and get a gift. I picked some flower petals from her garden, grabbed a plastic cup, a length of string, and a stick, and set it all up in the backyard. I had my trap in place, laid down on the grass, and watched intently for a leprechaun to wander by, drawn to the scent of the freshly picked petals. About an hour passed and I started to doze off. I don't know how long I was asleep, but when I woke up, the cup had tipped over and my trap had been sprung. I couldn't believe my luck. I was so excited. I put my ear up to the cup to hear if anything was squirming around inside. It was silent. As I lifted the cup, my heart sank. Of course, there was no leprechaun, but hidden in the grass beneath the cup was a small green boot. I was thrilled. I figured I hadn't caught the leprechaun, but surely he would want his boot back. I ran inside and told my mom the whole story. She encouraged me to write the little guy a note and give him his boot back. Maybe he'd give me a gift in return. So I pulled out a piece of loose-leaf paper in a pen and wrote a note. I told him that in exchange for the boot, I'd like a gift. I placed the boot on top of the note and left it on the kitchen table. Before bed, I even made sure to leave the back door open just a bit. In the morning, I rushed downstairs to see if my plan had worked. The boot was gone, and in its place was a Power Rangers action figure I had been begging my parents for the week before. I was so excited and proud, and I even brought it to school for show and tell, bragging to everyone that I had made a deal with a leprechaun. But life went on, and as I grew older, my belief in magic faded along with the memory. Years later, when I was in college and we were moving out of my childhood home, we all went through boxes of our old things. I was helping my mom with one of her keepsake boxes when she started telling me about each item and the memories tied to them. At the bottom of the box was a little green piece of felt, cut and sewn into the shape of a boot. The memory of that day came rushing back as I realized the effort my mom had made to help a little boy believe in magic. It's now one of my favorite childhood memories, and one of the most meaningful moments of my life. I still get emotional thinking about it and hope to do little things like that for my kids someday, because those little things really do make a big difference. Story 16. When I was around 10 or so, my family moved to a house out in the country. It sat about half a mile back from the road, and at the front near the road was an old graveyard. Old at least by Midwestern U.S. standards. Most gravestones dated from the 1800s to early 1900s. That first year, my parents wanted to start several gardens, including one up near the fence line by the graveyard to block the view from the road. I was helping my dad plant things when I found a row of large teeth. Horse teeth, I assumed. I thought it was odd, but my dad explained that sometimes people buried their horses just like we buried our cats and dogs. I didn't think much of it, and we just reburied the teeth where we found them. My dad never ended up doing much with that garden, and I never gave it a second thought. Years later, when I was in college and had long forgotten about it, one of my friends, who happened to be a teacher's assistant for one of my father's classes at the time, brought something up. He asked me about the time I had dug up part of a skull. I was confused at first, until he clarified. "Oh yeah, those horse teeth? Yeah, apparently that wasn't a horse. Story 17. I had a golden retriever growing up who absolutely loved chew toys. One year we got him one of those big, meaty cow bones as a birthday present and let him enjoy it in the backyard. He had it for a single afternoon, and then it disappeared. This thing was over a foot long. We searched all over the backyard, which was pretty large and had ivy, cattails, and other shrubs around the edges, but couldn't find a trace, not even some disturbed dirt to suggest he had buried it. We eventually concluded that a coyote had somehow gotten into the yard and stolen it, even though our fence was fairly tall. Fast forward 10 years. The dog had since passed away, our whole family had moved halfway across the state, and my parents were renting out the house. They drove down one weekend to do some maintenance for the tenants and found the bone, sitting right there on the backyard steps. It was meatless, somewhat bleached, but completely intact. My dad casually brought it up, and the tenants told him their little dog had dragged it out from under the back porch. All those years we thought our dog was just relaxing under there, when in reality he had probably been working on that bone in secret the whole time. Story 18. Well, it was a short-lived mystery for me, but it kind of counts. I was born in Alabama and moved north to Indiana when I was 4. We had 2 dogs that moved with us, and my dog was Hannah the collie. She didn't handle the move very well, and I remember her always trying to run away, chewing on doors to get outside, stuff like that. One day my mother told me that Hannah had gone to live on a farm in Alabama and that she'd be much happier there. I automatically believed her because when we lived in the countryside back in Alabama, all our neighbors had farms. It wasn't until I was much older, in my 20s, that a friend pointed out how much that sounded like the classic story parents tell their kids when a pet dies. So I asked my mom about it again, and she reassured me that Hannah really had gone to live with an old neighbor of ours in Alabama who had plenty of land for her to run like she loved. She even showed me pictures to prove it. It was nice to know she hadn't passed away back then, but for a few days, I felt silly for never questioning the "she went to live on a farm" line. Turns out I was smart to believe my mom. Story 19. Some backstory. I'm from Northern Ireland, and my parents split up when I was just a year old, in a very angry and messy way. When I was 3, my mom decided to take us to Glasgow, Scotland for Christmas. We had family there, and she thought it would be a nice change and give us a wholesome holiday experience. One day we were shopping with my aunt in a large shopping center in Glasgow, and I distinctly remember something strange. I saw a man wearing the exact same bright-colored coat my dad had at the time. He had similar colored hair, too. I remember trying to wriggle out of my mother's arms, screaming, "Daddy! Daddy!" But the man didn't respond, and a woman was with him. My mom kept saying, "That's not him, he just has a similar coat." Years later, I brought it up and said, "Remember that time I thought I saw Dad in Glasgow?" And she immediately said, "Oh my goodness, that was the worst day ever. It was him. Of all the places in the world, we happened to be in the same shop, in a different country, at the same time." I have a good relationship with my dad now, but hearing the truth about that moment really shook me. I used to think of it as a funny story until I learned what really happened. Story 20. When I was a little kid in the 1980s, I got swept up in what was known as the Satanic Panic. I went to a Catholic school in a mid-sized city, and they took it very seriously. Everyone did. I was convinced the entire world was secretly controlled by a group of devil-worshipping criminals, and I was determined to grow up and stop them. Then sometime in high school, the whole thing just vanished. One day, the so-called Satanic Illuminati were out to harm every child they could find, and the next, they were just gone. Eventually, I forgot all about it. Flash forward to my mid-20s. I was in college, sitting in my apartment and relaxing when I suddenly remembered the entire Satanic Panic. I wondered, whatever happened to that? Were they caught? Did I imagine it? Luckily, we had internet at home. This was still the early days, and I looked it up. I'll admit I had mixed emotions when I found out that 99% of it was completely false. I felt relieved for obvious reasons, but I was also angry. That hysteria had created a lot of fear for me as a child. Kids shouldn't be hearing stories about ritual abuse and sacrifices. At one point, my school even had a priest, supposedly an expert on Satanism, who showed us a film where people killed and ate what appeared to be a real cat. I was in junior high. We were told it was 100% real. I'm skeptical now as an adult, but it sure looked real to a 12-year-old. Anyway, the whole thing was deeply disturbing, but I'm glad I found closure. Today, it's one of those bizarre historical events that people are finally comfortable talking about. And now that I'm an adult, I find it fascinating. From how it started to how it ended, it really was a wild chapter in history. Story 21. When I was 7, my mom and her friend organized a private visit from Nicholas, St. Nicholas, on December 6th for me and her friend's child. Usually you'd meet him in school or at a public event, but this time it happened in the friend's living room, just for the two of us. He walked in and immediately started calling us by our names and talking about our recent accomplishments in school. I was mortified. It felt like something out of a nightmare. Here was this gigantic man with a deep voice who somehow knew things about me that only someone very close would know. It felt terrifying, like he had been watching me. Stranger danger had never felt so real. We never repeated that experience, and for years I felt uneasy whenever I thought about that encounter. I must have been around 25 when I finally brought it up with my mom and asked her who that unsettling man actually was. She was shocked that I had never figured it out. It was a close family friend who had visited our home regularly for years. He had known me since I was a toddler and often asked about school, so naturally he remembered the details. That explained how he knew so much. It only took me a decade and a half to solve, but looking back, it's actually kind of funny and a little sweet. Story 22. Not so much a mystery, but I remember visiting my dad one weekend when I was around 5, and my stepmom wore dark sunglasses to pick my brother and me up. When we got home, she removed them, revealing a black eye. Naturally, my brother and I asked what happened. She said she had tripped and hit her face on the corner of the counter. We were just kids, so we believed her without question. We never noticed any other bruises. One night when I was 17, I came home from a party about 5 minutes after curfew and was met by my dad, who had been drinking. My stepmom always said that a certain drink made him mean. He asked me why I was late, and I snapped back that I wasn't even 5 minutes late. He stepped up to me, all 240 pounds of him, towering over my lanky 6-foot frame by a good 4 inches. His eyes glazed over. I thought I was going to be hit right then and there, but he hesitated, stepped back, pointed a finger in my face and said, "When I say midnight, it doesn't mean 12:01, it means 11:59, or else, now get upstairs." Needless to say, I quickly untied my shoes and placed them neatly in the mudroom closet. He always yelled if I didn't, then skipped every other step running to my room. Once I was in bed, everything clicked. That night changed everything. I lost whatever respect I had left for him. I haven't spoken to him in over a year now, and before that, it had already been 2 years. Story 23. I always wondered why my parents were so much older than the other moms and dads of kids my age, and why I had 2 brothers named Chris. Throughout my childhood, friends would ask if my parents were my grandparents, and why both my twin brother and my older brother shared the same name. My parents insisted they had us later in life, and that we looked just like our dad when he was younger. They also told us that our older brother Chris had begged them to name us after him, so my twin got his first name, and I got his middle name. When we turned 15, my twin and I were doing homework, and I ran out of paper. I looked in a closet and found a briefcase. Expecting it to have paper, I opened it, and instead found a bunch of adoption papers. That's how we found out that our older brother and sister had been adopted together, and my twin and I were adopted separately years later. It turned out that our older siblings had always known they were adopted. They had even threatened to run away to their biological parents if they didn't get their way, and once actually did it. Our adoptive parents were scared my twin and I would do the same, which is why they never told us. Long story short, I eventually searched for my birth parents and found a biological family member's phone number when I was 21. I soon learned that both of our biological parents had passed away due to overdose by the time we were around 4. It was anticlimactic in a way because I had so many questions I would never get to ask, but I was relieved to finally have closure. I also felt grateful. No matter what, my adoptive parents will always be my real parents in every way that matters. Story 24. When I was about 3 years old, my parents and I lived in a nice 2-story house in the foothills. I was upstairs in the office watching cartoons when the phone rang. Apparently, I was one of those toddlers who loved talking on the phone. I'd even babble nonsense into an old handset to copy my dad. So naturally, I picked it up. A man on the other end knew my name and asked if I liked candy canes. He said his name was Alan and that he was at the front door with some just for me. Of course, being a little kid, I got excited and toddled downstairs to open the door. Now, in my little kid brain, this is what happened. I heard a knock, and just as I was getting to the door, my dad opened it, with my mom standing behind him. He had a sword, which was probably just the knife he always carried, and he scared Alan away. My parents then told me that this man wanted to abduct me and didn't actually have any candy canes. For 10 years, I believed I had narrowly escaped being kidnapped, something we just didn't talk about afterward. Turns out, it was actually a life lesson. My dad had made the phone call himself using a fake voice, knocked on the door, then ran around through the garage before I could get there. About a year or two later, he introduced me to a friend of his named Alan, and I absolutely hated him. My dad could never figure out why, until I finally brought it up years later. Story 25. When I was in grade 4, about 9 years old, we had a high school student visit our class to talk about a writing contest he had won. As part of his prize, his book was published. It was a novel about wolves in the afterlife. At the end of his presentation, he held a Q&A session. I raised my hand and asked him what made him want to start writing. He said, "I don't know, I just woke up one morning and went, I want to write." I thought he sounded a bit stuck up because of that answer, but I was still intrigued by his book, so I borrowed it from our local library and read it. Fast forward to last summer, I was 18. I was working in a kitchen and chatting with a coworker I'd known for over a year. We were pretty close, and the conversation turned to writing. He casually mentioned that he'd had a book published when he was in high school. I asked him what it was about, and he said it had to do with the spirits of wolves. In that moment, it clicked. He was the student who had come into my grade 4 classroom all those years ago. I told him about the question I had asked and how his answer made me think he was stuck up. He didn't remember the moment at all, but we both laughed about it. It turned into one of those full circle moments you never expect. Story 26. When I was about 3.5, we flew back to the UK after spending a year in Canada. On the way home, I lost Rupert, my beloved teddy bear. I was devastated for quite a while. Then one day I received a postcard from Rupert. He was in South Africa seeing zebras. Not long after that, another postcard came, this time from France. Then one from Australia. Rupert was traveling the world and writing to me about his adventures. About 9 months after we returned to the UK, my dad had a conference in Sweden. When we went to pick him up at the airport, he was there as expected. But he wasn't alone. While in Sweden, he had found Rupert in the airport lounge, ready to come home. Even better, Rupert had his cousin James with him, who looked just like him. So Rupert returned to me after his global adventures, and he brought along a friend. Fast forward 25 years. One night during a long Sunday dinner, the conversation drifted to childhood memories. I asked my mom and dad what really happened during Rupert's travels. They looked at each other, and my dad said, "I guess we can tell him now." My mom explained that when I lost Rupert on the flight, she called the airline, the airport, and the hotel we had stayed in before leaving Canada, but there was no sign of him. Desperate, she went back to the store where Rupert had originally been bought. My Uncle Barry, who had passed away by then, had purchased him for me when I was born in 1986, but the store no longer sold Rupert. Someone gave my mom the contact information for the manufacturer or distributor. She wasn't sure which, and they told her they still had 2 in stock. She bought them both because, in her words, you can't just take one and leave his friend behind. But the new Ruperts were too clean and new. They didn't look like a teddy who had been loved by a toddler for over 3 years, so my mom got creative. She washed one of them multiple times, dragged him through the garden, rubbed dirt on him, then washed him again, doing everything she could to make him look loved. Meanwhile, any friends going on holiday were asked to send me postcards from Rupert, sharing updates from his world tour. Once Rupert was properly aged and his travel story well established, my parents needed a believable way for him to return. So when we went to pick up Dad at the airport, Mom hugged him first and slipped Rupert and James under his coat. Then Dad pulled them out like he just found them in the terminal and told me how they had bumped into each other in Sweden. To this day, I still remember being absolutely amazed that Rupert could send me postcards. I never questioned how he could write or travel. His return after a 9-month adventure felt like magic. I didn't learn the full story until I was nearly 30. And honestly, it only made the memory more special. Mystery solved. Story 27. I have a vivid memory of sitting on my mom's lap. I can see her presence in the periphery in the memory. I'm looking across the small living room of the house I grew up in at my grandparents, who are sitting in our chairs with a suitcase between them. I've always loved that memory. I brought it up to my mom when I was around 10, and she said the only time my grandparents ever visited was when I was less than a year old. I was amazed. My earliest memory was from before I even turned 1. I shared that little fun fact with people over the years. Not often, but it was something I thought made me a little unique. Fast forward several years, I'm around 18, and my mom finds a picture of my grandparents visiting when I was a baby. She shows it to me, and I'm staring at my memory. There they were, sitting across from the camera in those chairs with the suitcase between them. My mom always took pictures. I didn't love it then, but I sure do now. And she was likely behind the camera, seated on the couch across from them. I realized then that I didn't remember the actual moment. I had a memory of the photo. And since the perspective was from the camera's view, it felt like I had been sitting on the couch. I probably also remembered being told that I was a baby when the photo was taken, and my brain filled in the blanks. That hazy image of my mom in my peripheral vision? Likely just a constructed detail. Sitting on her lap made sense, and maybe that's why it fit, or maybe I really do remember something from under a year old. Story 28. I used to have horrible recurring nightmares from about age 6 to 19. I'm 27 now. In the dreams, everything around me was moving at lightning speed while I stood still, like the visual effect in the movie Limitless when the main character travels. That movie terrified me for exactly that reason. I'd always wake up in a cold sweat, completely shaken. When I was 19, a girl I liked convinced me to try weed for the first time. And just like that, being high triggered the same sensation from my dreams. Only now it was happening in real life. It hit me like a wave of realization. Those dreams weren't random. They were probably the result of me getting contact high from my mom smoking weed around me when I was a kid. I didn't understand what was happening to my body at the time, and my subconscious turned it into a terrifying recurring dream. That moment was an epiphany. From that day forward, I never had the nightmare again, and I wasn't scared of Limitless anymore. My mom never knew the kind of trauma that caused me growing up, and I doubt she would have taken it seriously if I had told her. Since then, I've smoked maybe 30 times over the past 8 years, but honestly, it's not for me. Story 29. When I was 9, I had a sleepover in my brother's room. We heard this weird sound that resembled alien laser gunfire. Very 1980s, very sci-fi. We freaked out and ran to our parents' room screaming. They sternly told us to go back to bed and said if we kept it up, there would be no more sleepovers. This happened multiple times that night until eventually it stopped, and we both fell asleep. Almost 10 years later, I was helping my mom clean out her closet. I found a small keychain toy, and when I pressed the button, it made that exact laser sound from our childhood. I just stood there, stunned, as the memories came rushing back. When my mom stopped laughing, she finally confessed. She and my dad had placed the toy inside the air vent to prank us. My brother's room was directly below theirs, so the sound traveled perfectly. The thing is, they had completely forgotten to tell us the next day, and then forgot about the whole prank entirely until I found the toy. For 10 years, I genuinely believed we had been visited by aliens or maybe haunted by a ghost. And every time it comes up now, the whole family laughs hysterically. I only stopped being mad once I became an aunt and realized how fun it is to mess with kids sometimes. Story 30. I grew up my whole life with a black uncle. Even though we were a white family, and the surrounding community was just as white. He was as dark as night, and nobody ever questioned it. My dad called him brother, and so did my other uncles. He was just always there, part of our family. I assumed he was a close family friend, and I never thought to question it. At my father's funeral, someone approached me and started talking about amazing Uncle Gideon. That's when I heard the real story. When my dad was in his 20s, he had a severe bowel disease that required multiple surgeries and led to major infections. One day, he needed a blood transfusion, urgently. His blood type was O negative, which can be tough to find. My dad's doctor's office was located in a mostly black and immigrant neighborhood. In desperation, he walked into a local diner and announced, "A man needs O-negative blood today or he will die." Gideon stepped up without hesitation and donated. Not just that day, but several more times throughout the next year. Sometimes they donated side by side. That act of kindness saved my dad's life, and their friendship, forged in that moment, grew stronger with time. This was the 1960s, and friendships like theirs weren't exactly common where we lived, but it didn't matter. Gideon and his wife were at every family event, and my dad was at theirs. They became true brothers, not by blood, but by choice. Their friendship changed the way our family viewed the world. It shifted generational attitudes, opened minds, and set an example. What started as a life-saving gesture turned into a bond that shaped two families and everyone who knew them. Story 31. I lost an entire month of my childhood and couldn't figure out what happened for years. Only that it was the month I had been sick. All I knew was that I had a high fever. I remember it only in scattered snippets. One moment, I was getting picked up from school by my grandmother, and the next I was climbing into her bed. Everything went black after that, until the morning I returned to school. I came in late that day. When I opened the classroom door, everyone stared at me. I went to put my things away, but my teacher stopped me, hugged me tightly, and began crying in front of the entire class. I was confused for years, until recently. I finally asked my grandmother what really happened, and it turns out I had a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius. I was rushed to the hospital and stayed for about a week, on the brink of death. The doctors initially thought it was meningitis, but it turned out to be the flu. I'm guessing my fever was so high I became delirious, or perhaps I was even placed in a medically induced coma. I was only 4 years old and it took me a while to recover. Now I tell everyone, get your flu shots. The flu is no joke. Story 32. When I was between 5 and 9 years old, I lived down the street from Knott's Berry Farm. One year I was lucky enough to get a season pass from my mom. My grandmother watched me during the day, and on many occasions, we'd go to Knott's together. Sometimes I'd ask, "Nana, can we go to Knott's today?" And she'd say, "Okay, but call to see if they're open first." I'd run over to the phone, and she'd read me the number to dial. It wasn't until I was around 17 or 18 that I realized there was even a mystery to solve. I walked into my mom's house one day, and she and my Nana were sitting on the couch, laughing uncontrollably. I asked what was so funny, and my mom managed to say through her laughter, "Remember when Nana had you call Knott's to see if they were open?" I said yes. Well, how often were they actually open when you called? That's when it hit me. This overwhelming rush of realization, amusement, and a bit of embarrassment. The days Nana was feeling tired or under the weather, she'd secretly call my mom at work to let her know I'd be asking. I would dial the number Nana gave me, and my mom would answer her work phone with, "Knott's Berry Farm, we are closed today." Now my mom loves to tell that story to my friends and anyone else who will listen. And honestly, I love that she's so proud of that little trick. It still makes me smile. Story 33. As a child, I always wondered why my dad never visited, never returned my calls, never wished me a happy birthday or a happy holiday. I thought he just didn't want anything to do with me. No matter how hard I tried to reach out, I never heard back. I even called him on Father's Day just to wish him well, before he ever told me happy birthday or said I love you. One Christmas, my mom had her friend Greg call and pretend to be Santa, since she told me my GameCube was from him. She didn't tell me who it was, just said someone wanted to talk to me. I immediately thought it was my dad. I thanked him for the GameCube, told him I loved him, and said I hoped we could talk again soon. After the call, my mom went into my grandmother's room and cried. It broke her heart. I can't even imagine how Greg must have felt. It took me a long time to finally accept the truth. My dad didn't want to see me. He didn't want to call me. He didn't want to be a part of my life. Eventually, I found out he had married another woman and had a child, a son, a year younger than me. He raised that child. He took care of him, and he never once reached out to me. That was the bitterest pill I've ever had to swallow, realizing I was never wanted, that maybe he saw me as a mistake. I had to come to terms with this during my teen years, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. I've since moved on. I still carry resentment, and I probably always will, but I refuse to let it consume me. I've made myself a promise. If I ever have a child, I will be the kind of parent mine wasn't. I will be present. I will love them completely. I have more stories about my father if anyone's curious, but for now, that was my realization. Story 34. When I was little, circa 1985, we adopted my aunt's poodle, Muffy. She was already an older dog. A few years later, Muffy passed away peacefully in her sleep while my sisters and I were taking naps. Or at least that's what I always believed. It wasn't until I was in my 20s, sitting at the table with my mom and sisters, reminiscing about old pets, that I learned the truth. We talked about how Muffy must have known we'd be sad if she died while we were awake. We remembered how stinky she was from her bad teeth and that distinct old dog smell, but how much we still loved her. That's when my mom burst into tears and confessed that she and my dad had helped Muffy pass away. What? She told us that Muffy had been very sick and was struggling to walk. At the time, they couldn't afford the cost of euthanasia at the vet, so she and my dad laid Muffy in her bed inside a box and used car exhaust to end her life peacefully. My mother was devastated that she had kept it from us for all those years. She insisted it was a one-time thing, and after that, they created an emergency vet fund. I know this is true because they used that fund during multiple pet emergencies over the years, including when we had to put down my dog, Sparky. It was horrifying to learn this, and my sisters were very upset with my mom for a while. But please understand, my dad was a gentle-hearted man who only wanted our dog to have a peaceful end. It was the early 1980s and things like this weren't talked about or judged the same way they are now. They later taught us about the importance of having emergency funds, including for our pets. Today I have pet insurance and always keep at least $1,500 in a separate savings account for my dogs. Story 35. When I was in 5th grade, and honestly probably cooler then than I am now, I performed a long Irish dancing number to the river dance theme at my school's talent show. I wore a giant curly wig and one of those dramatic performance dresses. By the end, I was glowing because older kids, probably from 6th or 7th grade, were cheering and whooping during my set. I was riding high on the attention. As I walked off stage, a couple of those kids told me, "Good job," and gave me high fives. I didn't understand why they had picked me to compliment, but I assumed everyone had just felt the same energy I had while performing. Even my mom said, "See, honey, everyone loved it." Fast forward about 16 years. I'm 27, not even thinking about childhood, just minding my business. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the realization hits me like a ton of bricks. They weren't cheering for me because they loved the performance. They were mocking me. As I got older, I started to recognize that kind of behavior. Groups of kids pretending to cheer just to be cruel. And for the first time, I connected it to that moment at the talent show. My mom, bless her, either knew and tried to shield me from it, or genuinely didn't realize it herself. Either way, I believed her. The realization still stung, just as much as it would have if I had figured it out back then. Of course, it didn't actually hurt me in the long run, and I chuckled about it eventually. But that moment of sudden clarity, that was rough. Story 36. Blackbirds after secondary school, I started walking home instead of taking a taxi. I liked walking, and it meant extra spending money. Along the way, I noticed one or two blackbirds, maybe the same ones, perched on the power lines. They'd chirp loudly whenever I approached. Then they'd fly just out of my line of sight, swoop uncomfortably close to my ear, and sharply chirp again, repeating until I was a certain distance away. It used to freak me out. I had seen enough cartoons and horror movies with birds swarming people to feel genuinely spooked. And I grew up in a deeply religious and superstitious family. My mom always told me animals could sense evil spirits or danger. There were 3 routes I could take home, all parallel to each other. But somehow the birds always chose my route, and they always attacked me. After a while, I started to think I had done something wrong. Maybe I was evil. I even prayed at night, asking what I'd done to deserve it, and promised to behave better. Years later, around the time I turned 18, I learned that blackbirds do this to protect their young. They weren't warning me. I was just getting too close to their nests. It all made perfect sense, and I felt so ridiculous for not realizing it sooner. Story 37. Our family stopped celebrating Christmas when my 2 older brothers and I were teenagers, mostly because we didn't really believe in God. Everyone was fine with the arrangement. We were pretty lazy when it came to gifts anyway, and we'd end up just exchanging the same amount of money back and forth. One Christmas, when I was 14, we didn't have a tree as usual. But on the first day of Christmas, we found a tree in our garden. It was small, kind of ugly, and beaten up looking. No one knew how it got there. Since one side of our garden was directly facing the street, we figured someone walking by must have tossed it over the fence. Our best guess was that a Christmas tree seller didn't want to take unsold trees back home. So we decided to decorate it. Why not? It actually turned out pretty nice, and we all enjoyed it. Still, we didn't go back to celebrating Christmas after that. Years later, probably 5 or 6, we were all home for the holidays and remembered that weird tree. My brothers grinned at each other and finally told us the real story. They had gone to a Christmas rave the night before and were pretty drunk on the way home. They passed a Christmas tree stand that was closed and abandoned. For some reason, they decided to reach through the fence, grab a tree, and bring it home. They didn't even know why they took the smallest, ugliest one. Once home, they weren't sure what to do with it, so they just threw it into the garden. Story 38. This one I just solved last week, after 29 years. For my entire life, my parents had this old chest. They always told us it belonged to my dad's grandmother, who had brought it with her when she escaped East Germany and came to the US. Over the years, I looked at that chest often, and it had gotten pretty worn. So as a potential Christmas gift, my brothers and I pooled our money to get it restored. We asked our mom when would be a good time to take it in for repair. She asked why, and we said, because it's Dad's grandmother's chest and it's in bad shape. That's when she dropped the truth on us. When my dad's grandmother passed away in 1992, she left behind a few items for my parents. But when they arrived to collect them, they hadn't brought anything to carry the items in. So my dad ran across the street to an antique shop, bought the cheapest chest they had for $25, and used it to store the items. The chest had always been covered with other stuff, so none of us had ever looked inside. So what exactly did my great-grandmother leave behind that fit into that chest? 2 couch pillows and a warming blanket. Story 39. We always wondered why my dad had certain odd tendencies, but everything started to make sense after I was diagnosed with autism. Suddenly, I could understand his behavior. It was heartbreaking. He had spent his whole life being misunderstood, bullied by family, and isolated. But he wasn't a bad person. He was just different. The same thing happened when I was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. My grandmother and my dad both had symptoms, chronic fatigue, joint instability, but had never been diagnosed. For years, people in my family felt like they were just lazy or flawed. The truth was, they were living with undiagnosed conditions that shaped their lives and self-perception. When I finally got my diagnoses, it was like someone had turned on the lights. We finally had answers, but unfortunately, it came too late. My dad passed away from an overdose last year. I'm now the oldest living person in my immediate family, at 33. The best thing I know to do is teach the children in our family to seek answers and be kind to themselves. It hurts to know how much time we lost to misunderstanding, but I'm proud that the next generation is more self-aware and better at advocating for themselves than we ever were. Story 40. Back in the day, I got caught up in the website craze. This was before MySpace took off. I was part of an admin team for a video game forum hosted on Envision Free, and over time, I started learning basic HTML and coding. Fast forward a year, and I was working with the lead admin to migrate the board off Envision Free onto our own hosting. Since we were teenagers with no money, we created a Perl script to copy the forum, thread by thread, post by post. We even designed it to mimic user accounts by figuring out password hashes and feeding them into isolated Opera browser instances to automate the process. Through that, I learned how to reverse hash passwords. As a test, I tried it on my mom's Hotmail account. It worked. In under 10 minutes, what I found in her inbox changed everything. There was a conversation between her and my uncle. In it, she admitted to hating being a mom, resented my dad, and hated living away from her family. My uncle was encouraging her to leave. The last email in the thread was from him, telling her that if she really wanted to leave, she should accuse my dad of domestic violence, because he had a temper. I forwarded the email to myself and to my dad, printed the conversation, and explained how I found it. My dad confronted her, but never told her how he got the email. About 12 years later, my parents got divorced. My mom stayed at my place for a while and asked me if I would testify in court on her behalf if she sued my dad for alimony. I said I would, and that I'd bring up the email. I told her I still had a copy if she wanted to review it. She called my bluff. I showed her I wasn't bluffing. She moved out about a week later and never attempted legal action again. Later, my dad told me the real reason they got married was because my mom was pregnant with me. Their wedding was in July. I was born in January. And suddenly everything made sense. Story 41. When I was around 5 or 6, my brother and I each got a hamster. Mine was named Muffy. For the first couple of days, Muffy was incredibly sweet and cuddly. She loved being held and was calm and affectionate. But by the third day, everything changed. She became aggressive, biting, snapping, and refusing to be handled. It was like a complete personality switch. I was so confused and really upset by it. Years later, I brought up Muffy in a conversation with my brother. He got quiet and finally told me the truth. A few days after we got the hamsters, he had taken both of them to his friend's house. For some reason, he left my hamster and her ball on a table, thinking it would be fine as long as he taped the ball down. I still don't know why that made sense to them. His friend wasn't the best influence. They went off to play, and when they returned, they found Muffy had rolled off the table and broken her neck. They told my mom, and before I ever found out, she went to the pet store and bought another hamster that looked the same. Unfortunately, the new Muffy had a completely different temperament, much nastier and more aggressive. When my brother told me all this, I think I cried. It still feels weird even now. I understand why my mom did what she did. I was just a kid, but I don't think she handled it the right way. Story 42. When I was about 6 years old, something magical, or so I thought, happened in my bedroom. I was lying in bed with the door closed, trying to fall asleep. My bedroom was close to the kitchen, so I could hear my dad doing dishes, the TV playing, and light pouring in under the door. Then suddenly I heard a steam engine, and my room lit up in a soft golden glow. I sat up and saw a tiny little train emerge from the wall, steam puffing out of it, wheels turning. It chugged toward me, turned, and disappeared through another wall. It felt so real. I was in awe. I immediately ran to tell my mom, but she didn't believe me. She said I must have been dreaming, even though I had heard my dad in the kitchen the entire time. So I went to the kitchen and asked my dad if he had seen the train or noticed the golden light. He looked confused and said no. Years later, I learned about sleep paralysis and realized that's probably what happened. It finally made sense. I'm just thankful I saw a beautiful little steam engine and not something terrifying like aliens or shadow figures. Story 43. When I was 11, my siblings and I used to feed a stray kitten. She was scrawny and probably sick, but we loved her. We called her Charlotte. She was some kind of Siamese mix. Our parents wouldn't let us bring her inside, so we made a warm, dry bed under the porch and brought her milk and food. She didn't eat much, though. In hindsight, she must have been very ill. She came and went freely, until one day, she just never came back. Neighborhood kids had all sorts of theories. One girl swore she saw a man take her. The man was our quiet neighbor, the one with a ponytail and motorcycles. He never talked to us kids, but wasn't mean. He mostly stayed out of sight, mowing the lawn and helping his grandmother. Years later, when I was 24, I joined a local art class. He was there. We met weekly, and eventually everyone became friends. He still lived near my parents, and I realized he wasn't actually much older than me. When I was 29, we started dating. About 6 months in, he showed me an old photo of a fat, happy cat and asked if I recognized it. I didn't. Then nervously, he told me it was Charlotte, the stray kitten from when I was 11. Apparently, I had asked him about her back then, and he lied and said he didn't take her, just to avoid a weird interaction with a kid. Here's what really happened. On his way to work one summer morning, he saw a kitten lying by the road in the blazing sun. When he returned hours later, the kitten was still there. He assumed she had died, but he got a shovel to move her anyway. As he picked her up with his gardening gloves, she breathed. He brought her inside, syringe-fed her, and called a vet. She pulled through. Once she was stable, he gave her to his parents, and she lived happily until the year before he told me. He was terrified I'd be angry at him for lying and thought I might even break up with him, but I didn't. We're married now.